Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. We've been making a lot of progress through the Hunter's Nightmare lately, but we still don't know much about Simon, our guide. Thanks to our discovering his set of attire though, that's about to change. Hood of the Deceptively Shabby. Among the hunters of the Healing Church, there are those who disguise themselves and lurk on the streets. A person of lowly origins no one would think twice about. This is that sort of attire. The deceptively shabby are also preventative hunters, and they do not miss signs of beasthood. Or possibly, they always find that which they believe is there. All people have some sort of secret. So it sounds like Simon was a sort of spy or undercover agent for the Healing Church who turned against them. This would explain his knowledge of the Hunter's Nightmare and his respect for a major church figure like Ludwig. But as interesting as it is to learn these things about Simon's background by implication, I'm even more fascinated to see how the translators have handled a difficult problem posed by the very name of this set of attire. The issue lies in the Japanese term yatsushi, which is based on the verb yatsusu. That term has a few different meanings, but the relevant sense for my Daijisen Japanese dictionary is also the one that's listed first, which is to alter one's form so as not to stand out, or to adopt a shabby appearance. Crucially, as we can see from this Japanese language dictionary's definition, it's not just about adopting a disguise, as the Japanese to English dictionary entry from jisho.org suggests. It carries a specific nuance of making oneself look bad in order to blend in. But even that's not the full story behind this particular version of the word. Remember how I said the term yatsushi is based on the verb yatsusu? That's important, because as we can see by its use at the beginning of the third line of the item description, this variation is meant to function as a noun form, one that refers to the church hunters who disguise themselves in this way. To represent this nominalization in my literal translation, I've used the phrase, the deceptively shabby, both in terms of the item name and in terms of the relevant portion of the item description. But while that might be all well and good for illustrating a dictionary definition, it doesn't fit the specific use case of the term in the world of Bloodborne. As we learn from the first sentence of the item description, the whole point of this attire is to allow Healing Church hunters to do undercover work, and as the latter part of the description clarifies, these hunters act in a preventative fashion. So consider what this would be like from the perspective of a citizen of Yharnam. They could see someone who looks like a beggar attack and kill someone else for no apparent reason, declare that person to be a victim of the beastly scourge, and turn out to have the backing of the Healing Church, even though the truth of the deceased's beasthood is questionable. It's a position that fosters fear and suspicion, and establishes these hunters as something like the Healing Church's secret police. Do we really want to be referring to these agents as the deceptively shabby? I find that particular phrase not only too innocuous, but also too humorous and forced. So we're left with a problem. If that wording isn't going to work, how else can we convey the appropriate meaning behind the name of this set while keeping in line with the surrounding narrative context? Well, in this case, the official translators seem to have turned to an alternative solution. Rather than try to find the one specific term that could fill in for the Japanese word yatsushi, they've teased out the various aspects of that word and presented them differently in English. The first step in this process is to alter the item name from the literal Hood of the Deceptively Shabby to the official Harrowed Hood. Thanks to the use of the word harrowed, this gets across the idea that those who wear this set of attire have experienced trials and tribulations, implying that they've come down in life. Of course, if that were all the translators did, this translation might end up failing to convey the true purpose of this set of attire. However, note what happens in the official translation of the first two sentences. First, much like the Japanese, the opening line describes a group of Healing Church hunters who disguise themselves and go among the people of Yharnam. In the second sentence, though, the translators have included a reference to these harrowed individuals, thus linking the idea of the harrowed from the item name with the church hunters who obfuscate their identities. Then, since the English text has just identified who the harrowed are, the final portion of the item description can open with a simple reference to these hunters. That relieves some of the pressure of making this sound like it might be either an official or a common colloquial way of referring to the members of a Healing Church institution. Also, keeping the focus on the individuals who disguise themselves arguably helps give the impression that nobody can be sure who these people are or how much of an organization is behind them, which in turn feeds into the way the final line has been interpreted in the official translation. The shift from what is literally a general maxim about everyone having secrets to a statement about corner beggars not being what they seem simultaneously accomplishes several things. First, it provides further clarity as to how this set is used. Just in case the link between the Harrowed individuals and the attire that lets them travel unnoticed through the city was too subtle for players, this wording makes it easier to puzzle out that church hunters are disguising themselves as destitute individuals. Meanwhile, another thing this line does is bolster the impression of the fear and suspicion surrounding these hunters that I mentioned earlier. Having the concrete example of how some people on the street may look innocuous but actually work as spies for the healing church helps players better understand what the implications of such hunters in disguise would be. And finally, though the wording may be more specific than the Japanese, the general idea of things not being what they seem is still reinforced by this final phrase. The result is that by the time a player has finished reading the full English description, the core meaning of the Japanese has been communicated. And while the item name alone isn't as telling, that seems fitting for the outfit of a spy. But speaking of Simon, let's check in and see how he's doing now.
Who are you? I'm afraid I've made a botch of things. Oh, I can hear the bell now. The beast-eyed assassin. He's after me. Again. And again. It never ends.
Sounds like it might be ending for you. Any last words?
Please. I need you to do something. This village is the true secret. Testament to the old sins. It feeds this hunter's nightmare. Please. Bring to an end the horror. So our forefathers sinned. We hunters cannot bear their weight forever. It isn't fair. It just isn't fair.
Farewell, Simon. You were a memorable guide through this strange place. For all the importance of his last words, though, I want to begin my analysis by drawing attention to a small detail it might be easy to overlook. In the first of Simon's two dialogues, note how the official English translation refers to the beast-eyed assassin with the word he. In Japanese, by contrast, there's literally no pronoun there at all. Now, in and of itself, that addition isn't surprising. While Japanese does have words that correspond to the English he and she, in practice it's rare that a Japanese speaker will use those terms as often as they're used in English. Furthermore, in this case, adding in the pronoun he helps the translation more closely replicate the broken speech of the original. You can see that after the subject identifying particle ga, the Japanese includes a comma to indicate a pause. I've literally replicated this with an ellipse, but opening with the concept of the beast-eyed assassin, then pausing before continuing with the short phrase, he's after me, is just a more natural way of achieving the same effect in English. Anyway, what does surprise me about this is that the translators seem to know who's being referred to as the beast-eyed assassin. Nothing in any of Simon's own dialogue makes it clear who that is. For that matter, first-time players who stumble across Simon at the first opportunity and exhaust his dialogue won't know who he's talking about either. It was specifically so everyone watching this series would have a chance to see and hear for themselves the person Simon was referencing that I ran out onto the bridge leading to this village before doing my analysis. The thing is, under the circumstances I'm used to working in, there would be no opportunity to learn about the hunter who appears with the tolling of a bell wearing the hide of a beast. Instead, there would only be a lot of dialogue and maybe some item descriptions. That means either the translators had to look over the item descriptions themselves to work out that the beast-hide assassin is Brador, a male healing church assassin who skinned a cleric beast, or they would need to get that information from the developers. That means the seemingly innocuous detail of which pronoun to use for the NPC Simon is referring to indicates a level of either coordination or dedication on the part of the translators that shouldn't be taken for granted. Of course, it's not only in the relatively small translation choices that we can see this. There's plenty of thoughtful work evident in the more obvious moves away from the literal as well. To demonstrate this, let's go over the meaning and narrative function of the lines in Simon's second dialogue. He opens by asking us to do something, then explains that this village is the secret he's been referencing. It's the thing that we had to kill Maria to see, the location of the misdeeds performed by the old hunters which Simon says the nightmare sprouted from. In Japanese, Simon also makes clever use of a double meaning when he refers to it as tsumi no ato. That final kanji can be used either to indicate a location or to refer to the remains or vestiges of something. It's also the second character in the word ruins, just to give you an example, as these are old locations that still remain after a long period of time. Anyway, the next thing Simon says corroborates information he gave us before, which is that the hunter's nightmare used the site of the hunter's transgressions as the seedbed from which it drew sustenance. Having clarified that, Simon gets to the heart of his request, which is that we bring an end to the nightmare. Finally, he bemoans the pitiful state of the current generation of hunters who are suffering for the sins of their ancestors, even while he admits that those transgressions involved real wrongdoing. And just from that summary, I think you can see how despite the official translation using different words, it manages to get across the core meaning just fine. Still, there are a few specific translation choices that I want to highlight as particularly impressive. First, remember how I mentioned the Japanese makes use of an interesting double meaning with the kanji for the location of and also the surviving vestige of the old hunter's wrongdoing? Well, I think the phrase testament to the old sins manages to capture the essence of this meaning exceptionally well. By saying the village itself functions as evidence of the misdeeds of the past, the translators are saying that it's a location that persists as a monument to what happened there. Also, note how the official English makes the logic behind Simon's request more understandable by saying the testament to the old sins feeds the hunter's nightmare. It brings forward the nurturing role of a seedbed so that when he asks us to bring an end to the horror, it's easier to grasp that he's saying we need to cut off the source of this nightmare's sustenance. Meanwhile, at the same time, bring to an end the horror can be interpreted as Simon asking for relief from the suffering caused by the hunter's nightmare, which transitions perfectly into his last set of lines. Speaking of which, I love the way Simon's bemoaning of his fate was handled here. Rather than holding to the literal phrasing of, even if we are the descendants of sinners, the translators have wrapped both Simon's tacit acknowledgement of wrongdoing and his dismissal of it into the much more natural, so our forefathers sinned? Then they get across the idea of this being too much with a metaphor about bearing the weight of the sins of others, which emphasizes the wrongness of the situation by providing a relatable example of how unfair it is to pay for others' misdeeds. Finally, to top it all off, the translators employ the phrase, "it isn't fair," to replicate Simon's repeated expressions of self-pity, which both furthers the point and captures the essence of Simon's complaint. Really, I think both of these dialogues have been handled well, and make a good example of how sometimes the challenge in translation isn't in how to get across a difficult concept, but how to go beyond a literal wording that could be serviceable and instead think of the exceptional. But to get back to the story of Simon, though, there's one last item we need to cover. Bowblade of Simon. Hunting weapon of Simon, known as a hunter in the earliest period of the Healing Church. It is a custom-made product the Healing Church workshop had made to order for him, who despised guns. The large blade of the curved sword turns into a bow by means of a mechanism. But aside from a small handful of friends, everyone scoffed at the hunter Simon. The absurdity of challenging beasts with a bow. Here we can see that Simon was idiosyncratic, tenacious, and, importantly, from an earlier era himself. If he was a hunter during the first days of the Healing Church and still speaks of paying for his forefathers' sins, then whatever atrocity lies behind the hunter's nightmare must be even older. But that particular bit of lore translates pretty straightforwardly from the Japanese into English. When it comes to the translation itself, there are two things about this item description that stand out to me. The first is the use of the term choice weapon right at the start of the description. This is another example of the translators synthesizing information from the rest of the text to elevate the official English beyond the literal. Since they know that this weapon was not only exclusively used by Simon, but specially made for him, they're able to emphasize right up front that this isn't just any hunting weapon, as a literal translation might imply, it is uniquely suited for Simon's needs. You can also see the same principle at work later in the description, when the official English spells out that this was specially fashioned to his liking. Though in that case, it's not entirely clear whether the phrase is simply being used to help convey the literal idea that the weapon was made to order. Whatever the particular explanation is there, though, incorporating information from further on in the item description and referring to this as a choice weapon helps the official English version come across as more cohesive and natural. It's another example of how a translation can be improved by not being too caught up on the literal wording of the Japanese. And to take this one step further, the second thing that impresses me about this translation has to do with the way the translators have skillfully adapted information from a typically Japanese form of expression into an English one. The very last line of the Japanese is at once an incomplete phrase and a quotation. We can see this by looking at the final particle, to, which in this case is being used to identify the preceding statement as a quote of some kind. As for the initial part of that statement, Yumi de kemono ni idomu translates straightforwardly into to challenge beasts with a bow. That just leaves the crucial expression nado, which in this case is expressing scorn. It's the sense of the word that Jisho.org has listed as the likes of, though in this case it's being applied to a verb instead of a noun, so that particular phrasing won't work. Anyway, put all that together and you literally get something like, to foolishly challenge beasts with a bow, end quotation. In English, this sounds incomplete and weird even if you take out that final bit about ending a quotation. But in Japanese, it's a perfectly natural way of getting across the sort of derision Simon faced from the other hunters of his time. It was to represent this that I used the phrase, the absurdity of challenging beasts with a bow, in the translation comparison earlier, because I feel that's the closest English language equivalent. However, the official translation goes a few steps further towards making this aspect of the Japanese sound natural in English. First of all, note how we're once again seeing information distributed through the item description to smooth things out. The translators have identified Simon's unique weapon as being the source of the scorn directed at Simon and clarified that he was scoffed at for his choice of arms. Technically, this involves bringing forward an implication of the final line of the Japanese into the preceding one, but it perfectly sets up the final phrase. Meanwhile, the wording at the start of that last phrase, for who would dare, subtly shifts us into the minds of the hunters who scoffed at Simon without using any sort of direct quotation that might sound out of place. Finally, there's the use of the word measly to put even more emphasis on how insufficient these hunters deem the weapon. The result is a natural-sounding solution to what could otherwise have come across as stiff and forced. The only potential downside I see here is that repeating how bad of a weapon the other hunters found Simon's bow might make players less likely to use it, but I don't really think the translation takes things much further than the Japanese. After all, in the original, the thought of challenging beasts with a bow is clearly marked for derision. And it's obviously the weird bow that Simon had special made to avoid using firearms that they find absurd. Personally, I both like the weapon and see that last part of the description as a challenge to make it work, but maybe that's just me. If you feel differently, or if you have any other opinions about the episode you'd like to share, don't hesitate to let me know. Your feedback is always appreciated. Alternatively, if you want to hear my take on any of the other subjects I've covered so far, remember that you can check the Translationborne index linked below, which should be up to date within 24 hours. Until next time then, thanks for watching everyone.